Hi, everyone. This is an exciting topic. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, so we'll leave a little more time for questions, probably even than I allotted. We're talking about cinematic VR, and we have here I'm proud to introduce three of the early pioneers of this. Scott Brook, Vice President of Content for Jaunt, sitting on the end. We've got Tim Gedimer, Founder and Sound Supervisor for Source Sound. And one more chair coming. We've got, at the very end, Joel Suzel, Director, AR and VR for Dolby Labs. So this is going to be an interesting discussion, I think, because I think it's kind of divided into two parts. This is a technology that's extremely new, and I think a lot of people probably haven't experienced it, or maybe you have here. I mean, you're all very tech-minded. Assuming that you maybe haven't, then you split into two parts. You have the people who are making this right now, and not everyone has the tools, and then you have the experience. So kind of try to break it down that way a little bit. And so there's virtual reality, and we're also hearing about augmented reality, but there's this subset of cinematic virtual reality. So maybe we can, for a second, talk about that. But actually, first, I want to talk about, just introduce how you got into VR. So maybe Joel, a little bit about you and how you got into this.
Sure. I've been at Dolby for 4 years, where I was initially responsible for our flagship products on tablets and smartphones. That led into the introduction of Dolby Atmos on tablets and smartphones. And recently started this role as the head of the virtual and augmented reality business at Dolby that we're thrilled to have announced our debut just last week with a partnership with Scott and the team at Jaunt, using Dolby Atmos to create more immersive audio experiences for virtual reality that we believe is very meaningful for the space.
So, Scott,
I think I can trace everything back to three things. That would be Star Wars, Legos, and my Model 1 TRS-80 with 4K of memory. Because actually what this is all about is imagination and wish fulfillment at its core. But it's just the right time. The way I actually got into it was that I was at News Corporation's The Daily, which was the attempt to have a daily tablet-based magazine. I was there from the alpha all the way to the shuttering of the doors. But one thing that we did, which we learned a lot about and really led directly to this, is we had a panoramic image that you could use your finger and you could swipe around your screen, so you could rotate around your point of view. And right off the bat, we discovered that the statistics of the way people used it were just off the charts. People love to explore on their own terms. And it was very quickly after that we actually started looking into, could we potentially do this with video? This was back in 2010, and the technology just was not there. I think Ladybug cameras were the closest we could get to, and they're about 15 frames per second and required a huge amount of storage. Just wasn't practical getting in the field, so it was kind of shelved as an idea. And then really flash forward to the past 2 years, which has really been, it feels like it's been in, I guess, whatever VR time, feels like it's been 20 years because it's been so quick and also so much has happened. But when I saw the Kickstarter for Oculus Rift, it really got to thinking, what if you could bring that concept of video into this platform? And just by talking in Silicon Valley, just was introduced through a friend to the guys at Jaunt, the founders. We got to talking, realized we were on parallel paths, and it's just been an explosive growth since then.
Tim.
I guess you can trace our path to virtual reality back to our work with Dolby and doing Atmos mixes for various cinema and advertising pieces for the major studios. Probably 2.5 years ago now, we started doing Atmos mixes strictly for cinematic purposes. But along the way, we further cemented our relationship with Dolby and started doing some of these interesting projects that they were doing on the side to attract new filmmakers. And as a part of that process, they introduced us to Jaunt, and Jaunt was our first real foray into jumping into what it really meant to do audio for virtual reality. and in the true 360 space. And it seems, just like you said, it hasn't even been 6 months, 7 months since we've been working with John, but it seems already that it was much longer than that. So much has happened in just that short time frame. So.
I didn't even introduce myself really, but I'm Scott Stein. I'm with CNET. I'm a tech writer. I just was introduced to this covering various beats, virtual reality being one of them. And I think in the past 10 years that I've written about tech, I don't think there's a technology. I've been fortunate enough to see most of the platforms out there, and technologically, but not all the content. I wasn't able to be at Sundance, but the impact that I found for myself and for a wide range of people that you show it to is really profound. So you hear the hype about this, but then you give it to somebody who's in the tech industry, who's maybe an expert TV reviewer, who's an audiophile, videophile. They still get immersed. My mom got immersed. My kids were amazed. And so I thought that was pretty amazing. Diving into that question, go back again. So just starting, what would you call cinematic VR versus all the rest of the VR?
To me, why don't you go ahead, Scott?
Go for it.
What is
Explain it.
cinematic VR? Okay, so the way we define cinematic VR is it requires fundamentally, I guess, 3 things, right? And one's a little bit less tangible, but I'll get to it in a second. I think the first thing is that the visuals have to be truly 360 degrees. Wherever you turn your head, there's imagery that you're able to perceive with very low to almost hopefully no latency. So it's just a true representation of the world around you wherever you look. And then the second part of that is it should be stereoscopic, which is a true presentation of a discrete left eye and a discrete right eye. So you have a sensation of depth. I won't get into the subtleties of 360. There's many flavors, but I think that what people quickly discover is the thing that draws them in the most is a thing that replicates life as closely as possible, fulfilling that sense of sight like you normally would have. And this all gets to immersion and being present, which is the most important thing that goes along with sight is sound. You cannot underestimate how important sound is to this equation. Having a lifelike representation of the audio to your ears, not just in one fixed place, but wherever you turn, that it reacts to your direction. Like if there's a sound over here, as I turn, I should be able to see now that thing causing the sound, but also now the sound's coming at me straight on. That sense of presence from the audio and the visual is what gives you deep immersion, and I think that truly represents cinematic virtual reality. The intangible, of course, is story, because if you don't have story, I think this thing will be impactful, but it'll also have a little bit of a shorter impression. I think people adapt quickly, and as magical as this stuff is, and I never get tired of looking at it, unless there's something more to this, which is story, I think that's going to be the thing that causes us to have a slower adoption rate. But if you give people something to grip and something to latch onto, like the speakers before us were presenting, then you have truly cinematic VR.
Tim, do you want to take a crack?
I couldn't say anything more to that. That's
We covered it.
perfect.
Yeah.
Just one thing that I would add, it's kind of operational, which is the way that people interact with cinematic content, non-VR cinematic content, which is that it's easy to browse, quick to download, and immediate. And I think that's another characteristic of how people will interact with cinematic VR. It's not going to be, sit there and download a very large piece of content. You want to try it out and see if you like it, and then continue and get as immersed as you can as quickly as possible.
So you've taken cracks now at making some of that first cinematic VR content. You dived in. Some of it's out there to try as well. What have you been learning from doing this? And this is like, what surprised you so far? Maybe we talked before about how there's the storytelling may change or the adaptation changes. It seems maybe like it's movie-like, but obviously there are different elements. Is there something like film, something like video games, something like theater, how are the tools changing? That's a billion questions there. But basically, maybe talk a little bit about what surprised you, what you've been learning so far.
Should I go first?
Yeah, Joel,
Sure.
go ahead.
Okay. So I think, there are a few things. that we learned, I think, starting from some immersive gaming experiences that were wrong steps. For example, which was, one example was in a game, someone said, we want this to be as realistic as possible. And one of the things that we realized very quickly was that a game developer actually doesn't want to take into account the speed of sound. So, for example, when there's an explosion off in the distance, the most realistic thing would be to delay that sound based on the amount of time it would take that sound to travel. But we learned very quickly that that's actually not what game developers or gamers really want. What I think we've learned on the positive side that's been really telling is that virtual reality, is really very much like reality. And so what that means is that we're having to use our facilities in the ways that we're kind of used to. So, Scott was mentioning, sounds at various locations cause us to move our head. Well, that's really how virtual reality works. It's, we've developed ears and numerous facilities to survive and interact with our environment, and now we have a storytelling environment that that mimics the real world, and therefore we have additional challenges and also additional freedoms, I think, in creating stories.
Scott, go ahead.
I mean, this topic alone would merit another session. Because it's like, this is actually, what's crazy is, we've been really going at it. The first thing I shot was a guy going around in a skate park in circles on a bike, a BMX bike, and one of those deep pools with a camera right in the center. And that was January of 2014, right? So, that already seems like an eternity ago, because that most basic thing, the very first thing we learned from it was how important sound actually is. What we thought would just be kind of cool actually became our first navigational tool. It's sort of like your entrance to the Matrix, because what it actually teaches you is sound has place in virtual reality, and sound is very critical to get you to look in particular places. So if the sound wasn't accurately moving around your head when you're in virtual reality, you'd be lost. But the fact that we're able to replicate that sound as it was presented at the time of the recording allows you to track the person in the world of virtual reality. And again, we're talking about the recorded reality, not computer-generated reality. And from that very base concept, we started to learn a lot of things. Then we had a couple things that, well, first I would say there was no missteps at all, because we work collectively with a company called New Deal Studios in the Stan Winston School out of Los Angeles. And they've been the bravest production company you can imagine. The guy we've worked with just won the Academy Award for Interstellar. So they're adventurers, and they put their necks out there every day to try something new. But if something looks corny or maybe didn't come off properly, that's not a failure. That's the first step in learning this new language. And so the people that are willing to take those first steps are teaching us what works, what's part of the vocabulary, and hopefully when this stuff becomes democratized to the point where our cameras are out there in a lot of content creators' hands, they're going to have the language or a set of tools to help them tell their stories. And I'm going to keep coming back to story as the critical element of this. But I don't want to hog the spotlight talking about everything we've done, but it's and this is why it's important for people to come out and it's going to be out here for people to take a look at. But let me toss over to Tim, because the work they've done recently, I think, took our stuff to a completely different level. And just as we knew the sound sphere, it's what you can do to mix that sound sphere with additional elements.
Right, yeah, actually there are several points to make on this. One of the things that we found, just in the variety of different projects that we're doing with John, is that each of the projects seemed to require its own vernacular in terms of approach to the audio. So to give you an example, John did a recording of a concert, Paul McCartney, which you can see out there actually. When you're standing up on the stage, you kind of expect sound to be a certain way. Everybody's heard and seen Paul McCartney countless times in concert footage, in traditional festival footage on your television and whatnot. But this experience was different because the camera was right on the stage, and you could look around anywhere you want. Well, when you do a mix for a concert, typically you're doing a mix in front of you like this. But when you're on stage and Paul is here and the drummer is over there, you can't do a mix like that. It just doesn't work. So how are you going to make an experience that works with Paul's piano and singing over there and the drummer is way over here? You've got this sonic space right here that has to have something, and we have to figure out what are we going to fill that space with? Well, we don't have any musicians. Oh, the guitar player's way over there, but his amp's not over there, right? The sound is not coming from his actual fingers. So what do we do with this? How do we make this happen in 3D space? And what we come to realize is that some of the same techniques that we've been using in cinema for years are applicable here. One of which is, when people want to hear reality, they don't really want to hear reality. What they really want to hear is what they expect. And so there's a difference between what reality is and what people expect to hear as reality. And so in the cinema world, we are experts at crafting what it is that you expect to hear. Because when you deliver something that's not expected, it seems wrong to people. And there's a sense about that. You either watch something and say, wow, that was amazing, or you watch something and you think, that was weird. Something wasn't right there. And so we have to avoid those moments. We have to create an experience in virtual reality that has that same feeling, that it's what you would expect to hear. Well, no one really knows what is expected yet because none of this content has ever been out before. So we're trying to, each time out, every time that we have a project that we have to work on, we have to invent this and figure out what is it about this particular mix that sounds correct and what isn't. And this is a subjective aspect to what we're doing in the sound.
And I just want to add, the first time I heard a mix back from Tim against one of our pieces of content, it just blew my mind, right? And I mean, I really blew my mind because we had actually taken a crack at just putting in some sound effects for reference, and this was no more than just regular stereo, saying, hey, what about this? And we had listened back, a couple times, like, that'll be cool. But when we got it back, it was just life. I mean, and I'm going to tee this up for you in a second. The reason Atmos is so important to us for a mixing environment, and I'm just going to assume not everyone knows what Atmos is in terms of its mix, but sure. It allows us to put objects in space at a particular point, right? And why is that important? And again, why is that important for storytelling? It can work for both direction and misdirection. A great example I like to give is, say we put the camera down in a beautiful forest, the sun is setting and it's catching one of the trees, it's golden hour, it's just beautiful. You put on the goggles and it's just serene, and like, God, this is the most beautiful, serene place I've ever been, I feel really relaxed. And on that day, there was no bird in the tree, but I say, I really need a bird in that tree. I want something chirping. And I said, Tim, I need a bird put up on the branch, 20 feet up high. Sure enough, there's a bird, and it's tweeting. You're like, it's perfect. Now I got a bird there, and all of a sudden you say, but I want a tiny thud back here, really, really subtle, just kind of back behind me, maybe about 100 yards back. Sure, no problem. So I'm watching the scene. I hear the bird, maybe hear a tiny thud, but the bird starts chirping more, present. I'm like, wow, still whatever. And now I'm like, hey, can you make that thud a little bit bigger? This time it's like a boom. And I turn around and now I see a zombie horde coming over the hill, towards us. So that ability to use sound, not only to focus you for purpose, but also a purpose in the sense of setting something else up, is really critical. And it's critical also for the reason of virtual reality that gives you something you don't have in a lot of other spaces, and that's discovery upon further viewing, upon further angles. So the second time I watched that scene, fool me once on the bird, I'm checking out what's happening from the very beginning over my shoulder.
Well, that's something to go into a related comment. It's something I want to talk about. It's just, I find it fascinating. We talked about this before with artistic license and the creative act, and then people have choice. And cinematic virtual reality is a more passive experience right now, in the sense that it's not, it's not a game where you're going places for now, but you can make choices. And like you said, how does that influence the creativity within that act? There's a choice you make, but there's also direction that you're engaging in to offer options. Kind of reminds me of theater sometimes, like a site-specific theater piece. And there's a little bit of interplay there.
Yeah, so I mean, at Dolby, we find that we do our best work when we bring the science and put it in the hands of the best artists in the world, and bring the technology to then deliver those works of art to consumers in a predictable, reliable way. So what we've found with audio, in terms of interactivity, is that traditional filmmakers are very familiar with techniques how to direct users, viewers, if you will, where to look. Things like putting things into focus or making things brighter, making them move. And that's because they are under the assumption, rightfully so, that the frame is 100% in front of the viewer. And in virtual reality, what we found, and it's not that profound, that the frame is actually all around you. And so therefore what we found is that a number of techniques, new techniques, have to be applied in order to help direct the user and to help them be successful in this new medium. So regardless of whether it's interactive to the point where you simply just the content creator, want to make sure that someone sees the plot unfold, or in a more interactive sense where you want to make sure that the person opens the right door to have the right experience. You really need to have these new tools. And as I mentioned before, because you are by definition looking at a limited view of the frame, you have to use new techniques and you have to exploit your senses. And audio is evolutionarily the way that we've learned when and where to turn our head.
Right.
So we're very excited at those prospects.
It's an interesting thing, because I actually hear this come up a lot where people refer to it as passive. It's actually quite the opposite. Passive would just really mean, hey, I'm kind of slack-jawed, I'm watching Friends, and okay, another night, another dilemma. But it's what Cinematic VR is actually active engagement, and it's active in the sense that you are making your own decision about how you're going to experience the content. I think when people say it's passive, it's because they're thinking about games, and a game requires, some sort of motion of your hands, or requires some sort of direct engagement of, it's hard to express it, but I think it's a game-driven concept. And games in particular, because they're computer-generated, they allow for 6 degrees of freedom. 6 degrees meaning, rotation about one point, but then also ability to kind of duck around the side. That's not exactly possible right this second for video. That's a whole different science of camera projection. But what the thing is that, again, why sound is so critical to this, just as much as the visual, is that sound is going to help you decide how you interpret the scene. And it becomes a little bit like Rashomon, right? It's like, I'll compare my notes of how I experienced this scene versus someone else's. And the way I've constructed the story is going to be uniquely personal to myself. So I actually view that as extremely engaged and not, lean back passive.
That personal element is something that I think is really interesting about VR in a couple of ways. So we talked about taking movies and then you shrink them down onto a small screen. We did that, and everybody's watching movies on phones. And then VR, you're taking that small screen and putting it back on your face, and you're achieving something that's bigger and grander again, that maybe goes back to some of that big, film or even theater or those types of experiences. And you have two different types, I think, going on. You have the 360, but you also have virtual movie theaters. One of the more interesting elements in Gear VR, Oculus Cinema, where you suddenly feel like you're in the movie theater. Does that become something that challenges traditional movie theaters, or are we dealing with some balance between the personal and the communal? Because you have everybody together watching, and then it's getting more personalized. Now it feels grander, but you're on your own. Is that something to, everyone's sitting with helmets on, or how do you share that together? Is that present interesting challenges, or where do we go with that?
Well, I certainly think that both mediums will continue to flourish. I don't think one is going to come at the cost necessarily of the other. Maybe the share of minutes of how people enjoy entertainment will shift, but certainly I think it's really exciting to go to a Paul McCartney concert, and I would certainly be very excited to go to a Paul McCartney concert in real life. And I would be more excited to do that with a group of friends, and I would be even more excited to serendipitously run into a group of friends at that concert, and maybe even hang out with them after that concert. So the way I see it, and you know, it's not here yet, but I think very shortly we'll have that social element added to all of our virtual reality experiences.
I can map that out pretty clearly of what's going to happen. So, for example, take the Paul McCartney concert or the Jack White concert. And here you can pull on a game reference, right? I want to play Call of Duty with 3 of my friends. We go onto a game server, we pick a room, and we start the game, and we're all synced together, and we're running around inside this world. It's not that challenging to basically have people sync the Paul McCartney experience starting at the same time. And if we have 3 camera positions, you choose, do I want to be up on stage, do I want to be on the front of the stage, or do I want to be in the pit, right? And each person can choose where they want to be, but of course, if you have a headset, it's like, hey dude, you got to come down the front row. I think someone's about to do something completely crazy. You got to get down there. Okay, hang on a second, tap, there I am. Or it's like, you really got to say, Paul's really getting into this, come up on stage. So that is clearly one aspect. But you actually asked a question that I've thought a lot about, and I won't name the name, but we had this question from a studio head, said, what's this going to do to the movie business and theaters? I actually think that you're going to see a convergence, because you think about what a theater is, right? And take Gravity as an example. I want to go see Gravity on the largest screen possible with the most intense sound system possible, right? So Atmos, IMAX. And I go in there. Now, that is being projected maybe by a laser projector that costs $1 million. It has a cooling system that's a refrigerator that actually has its own room. You're not going to have that in your house. Most people won't have that in their house. So you go to a place that presents that opportunity to experience something at a higher scale that can be monetized over the people who come in all the time and place in the seats. Now think about what that means for virtual reality. So if you accept that a theater is a place that people go to have a communal experience, and then you start deconstructing it. So say today, the best screens you can get on your phones for presenting VR are like 2K, Quad HD, 2K, AMOLED. But let's say that it was possible that HTC or LG or Sony had an 8K screen, but it cost $15,000. Now, you're not going to buy a $15,000 phone, but say there was a place you could go to that had 20 places that you could place a helmet on your head where the resolution was just absolutely insane, so richly detailed. And on top of that, say that the seat wasn't a reclining or sort of a play seat like this, but more of like a haptic chair that gave you some sense of force feedback, or maybe where you put your arms, there was some resistance where you had a sense of like motion. That becomes a theater, right? And it's a place where the content you could have at home is, you can have your experience at home, that's the 2K screen, and it's awesome, but if you really want to go for 20 minutes of mind-blowing entertainment, 10 of your friends go to the theater, and you step into another world, and you walk out, and you're like, that was absolutely mind-blowing, insane. Of course, you've got the Atmos sound, coming in and presenting life as it was. And I think that is what we're heading towards. I mean, and that's communal in the pure sense of it.
Do you see any hybrid possibilities that way, where some people might actually watch the screen, other people would maybe have goggles on at the same time?
Yeah, but I think there's also, maybe not in the way you think. I think you can look at like Twitch and some other ways of, it might be really entertaining to see someone experience. I mean, I can just look at someone watching our horror piece, and man, it's a good time to watch someone who actually viscerally reacts to some of the shock moments in it. But if you had like an interactive element to your VR, just like you watch like some of the huge things right now are watching people play video games, which seems like completely insane, but 50,000 people will attend a coliseum to watch people play video games, right. And 75 million people watch online. Why is it so strange to think that I watch someone experiencing virtual reality in a really kind of crazy, interesting way would be so far off?
Sure.
I think this is saying that that there's 7 minutes left. I'm making sure that's right. I have 100 more questions that I want to ask. There were a lot of things going into ranges that we're talking about empathy, which is there are a lot of amazing questions with this. I watched Clouds Over Sidra, which I thought really made me cry, was amazingly emotionally powerful. We were talking about issues of empathy. There's another question about how do you get people to experience this? I'm sort of throwing these out because if people want to ask these questions, I don't want to have, we'd go on for another 2 hours with this. But we didn't even discuss the point that, you have these, well, you did actually, that you have these tremendous high-end experiences, and then you have Google Cardboard. And the audio fidelity ranges, the visual quality ranges, is it, or maybe we're more, and the length of these pieces has a limitation. Bite size, are we in a phase of getting people into trying to experience this more than build out the perfect hardware, or is it more about making the hardware invisible completely? Because you're seeing a lot of elements of this. There's no question there particularly, but I want to throw it out to some people out here who might want to have questions to ask you. In the front, with the blue shirt. Here at the, thanks.
Hello. I was wondering, there are some startups working on putting 3D sensors all over the stage, as an event, for example, allowing the the viewer to actually move around the stage. Is this something you see as that will be the final realization, or is it something that will be an alternative way of recording?
Well, I mean,
events?
that gets to, you know, that's, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Matterport would be a good example, right? So, I mean, it's a different way of capturing the world. You're not going to use it to capture video. It's good for capturing a scene, because think about what happens. Say, you know, if I have very sort of discrete slow motion, it probably won't be that hard to understand the geometry of me moving around. But let's say that there's a flurry of fingers moving around, or like something really fast happening. The technology is not there yet to really discrete. I mean, you're going to end up with like blocky images. What it does is actually can give you a really good background, right? That you can move around, and like something like Otoy, where they can render out in real time different scenes. But that's based on pre-constructed geometry. If you really, I mean, I get the question, like the way we'll actually get the ability to walk around a scene, like a video, is you're going to have not only outwardly facing cameras, but inwardly facing cameras. And you're capturing not just the video, but also the geometry of the action. And then you're going to be reprojecting what you captured visually onto that geometry. That's a whole different level. That's photogrammetry. It's way beyond sort of this topic. But you know, I really use this as a springboard to get to a really important point. I think it ties it all together. Like, the most important thing right now is that this stops being, well, I say stop, it's not a matter of stopping, it's actually happening right this second, is that people are going to understand, like, this is happening extremely quickly. I can't break any NDAs, but I can say that the level of content that is already being generated at a very high level with very serious people with very serious IP that they want to protect is profound. And what you're getting at is the reason, actually, you know, this alliance with Dolby is so important. Everyone looks at the Oculus Rift, and I kind of think like Oculus Rift, it's so critical in what it did for the industry, but I think everyone starts to think as Oculus Rift is representative of VR in general. There are many forms and many ways of consuming VR, and I think the most important, it's mobile, right? And I'm not just talking about Gear VR, which is one manufacturer with now 2 phones and 2 holders. It's much broader than that. What it should be, and what actually is and will be even more apparent in the next like 3 or 4 months, it's what's in your pocket. You have it right this second. If your phone is within the past year of an Android build, or, you know, say it's an iPhone, you know, 5S, 6, or 6 Plus, you already have your own personal VR gateway in your pocket. And what's absolutely critical is that I can use that screen to push the VR visual of very good stereoscopic imagery. But now with the coupling of Atmos on the phone, I can deliver lifelike, really lifelike audio that someone like Tim will mix, and I can get a very deep level of engagement, and you need nothing more than a handout as you walk in the door of someone giving you a Google Cardboard. You slot your phone in, and you're gone, and that file will take you places.
I think,
Yeah.
you know, this highlights, I think, both your question, Scott, and the question from the audience, suggests that VR is really a meta category in many ways, both in terms of the form factors and how you'll interact with it, as well as the levels of interactivity and what those experiences are. It's kind of like, I would think of it almost as the term video, because you can have video games, you can watch a video on your TV, and you can watch a video on your phone, and a myriad of other devices as well. But each of those is very different. So I think, you know, there's certainly the right device at the right time. I agree with you, Scott, that mobile, as we've seen mobile capabilities evolve in smartphones and consumer patterns change, it is, I'd say, the most relevant in terms of minutes engaged and frequency of engagement. But I could imagine, there are some contraptions out there like the Omni, which is an omnidirectional treadmill. Certainly not something that you're going to break out on the bus, but you might have that in your theater or your home theater. So I think it's almost simple, and it's so new. It's hard to say this, but I'm going to go on record and say it's too simplistic to just say VR is one thing.
Yeah.
VR is many things. Cinematic VR is a very exciting thing. Gaming VR is a very exciting thing. Mobile VR, home theater VR, all of these are going to have their own nuances and benefits.
I want to make sure we get some more questions too before we run out. Does anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
I want to talk about the Oculus because I've been using it this year for the gaming industry. You could put it on and you could walk about a casino and arrive at a table and they'd deal you cards. But when you got to the slot machines, you couldn't grab the thing and pull it down. They said that was under development. That was the next thing, but they were only talking about 1 month away. But there's an Oculus out there on a display. I actually can't remember the person's name, but you're watching it and it's a cinema situation and you feel as if it's the same as being at an IMAX. You have a headgear thing on and you're watching it, but then you look down and you've got an avatar body. And it's kind of weird because in the other ones you don't have an avatar. It's actually just like a ghost type thing running around and getting given cards and things. So that was a very weird experience. And I was wondering, is that how you see the film industry using it? Where you would be maybe on stage with Paul McCartney with an avatar body, or?
I think it depends, what kind of avatar body you want.
Yeah.
I mean, is that
The ideal avatar body?
Yeah, it would not be the one I have. But no, I think that there's actually a running debate right now in cinematic VR as to whether or not you should see something at all when you put on the goggle. You get to one part of it, right? And that has to do with, should it be gender specific? Should it be gender neutral? Do you choose it? If it's CG, is it going to look out of place and strange? But forget the body for a second. There's a question of whether or not you should paint out the bottom altogether, so you're like a free floating orb where you literally can look through your body, if you turn over. And there's people say, no, you should have at least a logo on the ground or some sort of centering mechanism. So I think this is very much open to debate, but you did touch on another thing, which is haptics and your ability to put out your hands. I think Sony Morpheus did a phenomenal job in demonstrating that just those two controllers and having gauntlets. I don't know if you've tried the demo, but you can see just your hands. They're disembodied hands. But the fact that you have a representation of your hands that can grip in front of you makes a huge difference to presence. And without going into details, I would just watch the space very closely over the next several days.
I think that's interesting because whether that becomes a factor in cinematic VR and changes the nature already. You say that, we think we know what it is now and it begins to alter. There are cinematic video games, I think of Heavy Rain, PlayStation's made a lot of them, David Cage, that are, like you say, there are interaction elements, but really unfold in a way that's far more cinematic. Other questions? We have time for a few more if anyone wants them. If not, I have more questions because I didn't even get to a few. Empathy. Speaking of perspective, I want to address this. You mentioned looking and realizing who you are when you look down, and that it's transporting. There's an element of, I think, the beginning of telepresence in VR, which is a whole other direction, where you're not just going someplace, but you maybe are often someone else. That was explored. It's been explored in several different ways. Sundance, we talked about the Party, which was a documentary. It's a film exploring date rape, and it looks at it through two completely different perspectives. Unfortunately, I did not see it. Those who did there isn't anyone who wasn't moved by it and disturbed by it and provoked by it. And what happens in there? What are the opportunities and the challenges with empathy? And I even go to Clouds Over Sidra because being there, I felt transported emotionally, where it makes me cry. I was surprised. How does that work in film or in VR, cinematic VR?
I mean, just from my perspective, I would just say that the immersive quality of virtual reality gives us just that one little step closer toward it being something that's happening in front of you. And I can't explain it myself, even, my reaction to being first person in that film about date rape was phenomenal. It really did put you in that headspace. You didn't have to project yourself onto the screen and say, oh, I identify with that character, or I don't identify with that character. That's more like what I would do. You just become it, and it's much more visceral than a cinematic experience, than a traditional cinematic experience. Much more visceral.
Yeah, and I'd say that the thing to take away from that is not necessarily to point to any specifics that generate empathy, but to understand what the tools are for creating that empathy, right? Because the rules are being written right now. I mean, there are no rules. I mean, well, yeah, I could tell you a couple rules. Yeah. Don't introduce this side-to-side motion on the camera. That is a one-way vomit comet. But it's, no joke. But what, just to tie, hopefully ties us all together, what we're trying to do at Jaunt is to create a camera system that allows you to capture the world, that works on principles of computational photography, which without being a geek, which I am, but it's like, to get into it, it lets the computer do the stitching and make sense of the color space and is able to rapidly assemble the thing. But this thing has to exist within a current post-production pipeline that people are familiar with. Otherwise, if it's too alien, then people they just won't make it work with their system. But so if we can create the camera, the software, and the player that presents the stuff the way that presents what we hope is the most realistic presentation of immersion, then we've succeeded, and we will work with partners like Dolby that amplifies the tool set that's already out there and that you're using and starts to integrate it with our approach, but using existing familiar workflows. Then we've succeeded in giving the tools to people who want to tell their stories and find ways of expressing something that will generate that empathy. And then someone like Tim can step in and help the creative say, yeah, I get where you wanted with the visuals, but now let me add a sonic layer using these tools to really deliver something in a place, as you say, a headspace that's fundamentally different.
The rules of cinematic VR needs to be an additional 2-hour-long panel at some point in the future. I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Tim, Scott, Joel, and all of you. And we also want to invite you out to the lobby for refreshments, networking, and demonstrations of some of the virtual reality experiences. So thank you.